G'day guys, it's your boy RP, back again with another episode of Pickels Pickles. Now today we're going to be making fermented cabbage or sauerkraut, which is one of the quintessential fermented vegetables. It's really easy to make and it doesn't require many ingredients, so let's give it a go. So all I use for ingredients is a head of cabbage, and then I've just got a few spices. So for flavour, I've got about a tablespoon of caraway seeds, and then 4 cloves of garlic that have been crushed and sliced. I've also got a tablespoon of mustard seeds, and they add a nice flavour, but they also apparently have something in them called tannins, which get released into the sauerkraut and help keep the cabbage crispy through the fermentation process. And lastly, you'll need some salt to create the right environment for your vegetable brine. So the first thing you need to do is slice up your cabbage. So I like to just chop off the base, then chop it into quarters, and then just cut out the core from each quarter of cabbage. Then you just have to cut your cabbage into strips. Now the width of the strips is up to you. If you cut the cabbage nice and thin, then you're more likely to end up with a softer sauerkraut at the end of the fermentation. But if you leave the strips a little bit thick, it's more likely to be crispy. So I like to chop the cabbage as thin as I can, just because I prefer the sauerkraut to be a little bit softer. So once you've sliced up your cabbage, the next step is to add salt. Now when we made our kimchi, we covered our cabbage in a brine to help wilt it down, but with sauerkraut, we're going to be dry salting it. The idea is that by applying salt directly to the vegetable, it's going to draw out the moisture that's already inside the cabbage and actually form its own brine without us having to add any water. In terms of how much salt you use, you generally want to be using about 2% of the weight of the vegetables. So for every 500 grams of cabbage, use about 10 grams of salt. So my trusty kitchen scales are telling me that I've got just over 2.4 kilos of cabbage, and 2% of that works out to be about 50 grams of salt. So I'll measure out 50 grams. And then I'll add it bit by bit, giving it a toss in between to sprinkle it through the cabbage. So once the cabbage is covered in salt, it's going to start drawing out the moisture inside the leaves. And the next step is to give it a bit of a squeeze to crush the leaves and help that liquid escape. Now you could stand here all day crushing cabbage until all the liquid's released, but I'm lazy, so what I like to do is give it a little bit of an initial crush and then come back every 20 or 30 minutes and repeat the process. So it's only been about 20 minutes, but you can see that the leaves are just dripping with water. And so you can just see all that liquid collecting at the bottom of the bowl, and that's very important because that's going to be the brine that we're going to use to ferment our sauerkraut. So then I just keep crushing the cabbage every 20 minutes or so for about an hour. So when I come back at about the hour mark, I'll add the spices in and then I'll let them sit for about half an hour, and that'll let the flavours infuse into the sauerkraut. So while I give it a bit of a mix, I thought I'd take a bit of time to talk about the history of sauerkraut. Now most people know that sauerkraut's a German word. It literally just means sour cabbage, and nowadays it's commonly consumed in European countries. But what a lot of people don't know is that it's actually believed to have originated in China. Apparently the workers who were building the Great Wall of China developed the technique of fermenting cabbage as a way to preserve the vegetables over the winter time. And then when Genghis Khan brought his armies through Europe, he brought with them the technique to ferment cabbage, and that's how sauerkraut kind of became a staple of the European diet. Another interesting fact is that Captain Cook, the British explorer, noticed that Dutch ships that were carrying sauerkraut on their voyages tended not to have as many cases of scurvy as their British counterparts. And so Captain Cook insisted on taking sauerkraut on all of his voyages, which was effective in reducing the incidence of scurvy, mainly because sauerkraut's actually a pretty good source of vitamin C. So check this out, after an hour and a half of just waiting and crushing, we've released an incredible amount of water from these cabbage leaves, and that's going to make the perfect brine for our sauerkraut, and we didn't even have to add any extra water at all. So at this point, all we need to do is pack the sauerkraut nice and tightly into the jars. Now it's a good idea to intermittently press the cabbage down to pack it in as tightly as possible. So once you've packed the cabbage into your jars, the tricky thing is making sure it stays submerged underneath the brine. Because the brine is salty, the cabbage is going to want to float to the top, so you need something to weigh the cabbage down and keep it underneath. This is pretty important because the process of fermentation is anaerobic, which means without oxygen, so you really need to keep the cabbage under the brine where there's no oxygen for the fermentation reaction to happen. And if you get bits of cabbage floating on the top exposed to oxygen, it's more likely to grow things like molds and other things that you really don't want as part of your sauerkraut. So I just use these little plastic fermentation buddies that I got on eBay, and they just sit nicely on top of the cabbage and help to keep everything submerged. Now there's heaps of ideas out there about how to keep your cabbage submerged, and most of them involve using something as a weight to put on top of the cabbage. Before I got these, I'd take a radish and I'd cut it into little circles, and I'd put the circles on top of the cabbage, and that'd just help to keep the cabbage underneath the level of the brine. But I still found that every couple of days the cabbage would be sneaking up to the surface, so I had to come back pretty frequently and just push it down below the level of the brine again. And then you just want to fill your jars up with brine. Make sure you leave about an inch of space at the top because the cabbage still might lose a little bit of water, and the last thing you want would be for the brine to overflow. And now all you need to do is pop your lids on and they're ready to ferment. So I've made several batches of sauerkraut now, and along the way I've made a few mistakes. So I'm going to let you know where I went wrong, so hopefully when you make your own you can avoid those pitfalls. Now the first mistake I made was using too much salt. Now salt's pretty important for promoting the growth of the lactic acid bacteria that turns your cabbage into sauerkraut, and also to inhibit the growth of the bad bacteria that might spoil your sauerkraut. But if you're not careful and you add too much salt, it can severely inhibit the fermentation reaction, and it's going to be really difficult to make your sauerkraut. So make sure you use the right amount of salt and you'll have the perfect environment to ferment your sauerkraut. Another issue I had the first time I made sauerkraut was I used a plastic container with a lid that didn't really have a good seal. And what happened then was the brine actually overflowed and squeezed through the lid and it spilled out onto the bench. So if you don't want to wake up to cabbage juice all over your kitchen, check the level of the brine frequently and use a glass jar with a tight fitting lid. And just to be safe, put it on a tea towel or in a tray. The third thing to remember is that you really have to make sure that you ferment your cabbage for long enough. There are a lot of recipes out there that recommend stopping the fermentation and putting the sauerkraut in the fridge after only a few days. I mean, that might be because they think people want their sauerkraut to be ready as soon as possible, but while you get some fermentation happening in that short time period, it's really not long enough for it to develop the characteristic flavour that you're looking for in a good sauerkraut. So I'd recommend leaving it out at room temperature to ferment for at least 2 weeks. In my experience, it takes about that amount of time for the bacteria to ferment the cabbage and produce enough lactic acid to give it that nice sour flavour that you really want. And if you leave it out for longer, and I've left mine out for up to 4 weeks before, you can really develop that flavour even further. Alright, so I'll put away the sauerkraut and I'll come back and check on it periodically as we leave it to ferment for a couple of weeks. Just like when we made our kimchi, the fermenting cabbage is going to be producing carbon dioxide, so it's a good idea to come back every couple of days and pop open the lid so you can release any pressure that's building up inside. And if you need to, push down the cabbage to keep it below the brine. So that's what we're talking about, all those bubbles are carbon dioxide, and that's telling us that the fermentation is going pretty well. So it's finally been 2 weeks, so it's time to taste the sauerkraut and see how it's going. So you can see that bubbling that we had at the start has really slowed down, which kind of tells us that the fermentation process is slowing down a fair bit. So take out whatever you're using to keep the cabbage submerged and pull out a little bit to taste. So yeah, after a couple of weeks, that's fermented really nicely. I mean, it's still nice and crispy, but it's had a good amount of time to develop a nice, strong, sour flavour. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop this one in the fridge, but I'm going to keep this one out for another couple of weeks, just to see if I can develop that flavour even further. So that's how you make sauerkraut. I like to eat it as a snack by itself, but it also goes great if you're looking for an extra side to have with one of your meals. For example, here's some pairing well with some roast pork that I made a few nights ago. Well, thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos as they come out, and feel free to give it a like if you enjoyed the video. And as always, I'll see you next time on Pickles Pickles.